That house isn't wealth, it's paperwork, wrapped in marble and sold as the American dream. Because here's the part most people miss. In Tony Soprano's world, the expensive thing isn't the mansion, it's the story that makes the mansion look legal. A 2-story foyer doesn't just say success, it says, please don't audit me. And that's exactly why it matters that Tony can point to a respectable title, a respectable paycheck, and a respectable looking business, while half the crew can barely justify a car lease without sounding like a punchline. So when people ask, why does Tony live like a suburban king while the other guys live like they're hiding from their own bank statements? The answer isn't power, it's cover. This is a house built to survive scrutiny. Family construction discounts, friendly inspectors, a cost that looks normal on paper while the reality sits on a hill daring anyone to ask questions. And the best part? The show quietly tells on the house constantly. Doors that don't fit, cheap workmanship, an unfinished basement, because the goal was never perfection. The goal was plausibility. In the next few minutes, the mansion gets treated like what it really is, not a trophy, but a carefully staged alibi with crown molding. The question of why Tony Soprano's house looks like it was designed by an architect who charges by the column, while so many of his colleagues live as if they are committed to tasteful invisibility, has a mundane answer. In this line of work, the most dangerous item in the home is not a firearm, it is an unexplained mortgage. The mansion is not merely a residence, it is an accounting story, a generational signal, and, because nothing says serious businessman like a 2-story foyer, a carefully staged argument that crime can be made to resemble respectable suburban success. Begin with the rule that governs every purchase larger than a deli sandwich. It is not about how much money is earned, it is about how much money can be admitted to earning without inviting the government to RSVP. Buying a conspicuous asset is an engraved invitation to follow-up questions. Most of the older operators understand this instinctively. They prefer their wealth compact, quiet, and deniable. Cash in safes, cash under floorboards, cash that never has to explain itself to an auditor with a calculator and a sense of humor. Flashing money is not merely tacky, it is operationally illiterate. Tony's advantage is that he can purchase display without immediately purchasing disaster. Unlike contemporaries whose legitimate work reads like a satire of underemployment, Tony has the rarest luxury, a plausible W-2 and a respectable-looking corporate title. The veneer at Barone Sanitation matters. It lets a man point to consulting income with a straight face, and it gives the household a narrative sturdy enough to hold a larger mortgage. That legal scaffolding is reinforced by other front-facing ventures. A butcher shop that can be discussed as the family business, steady-looking streams of cash flow, and the ability to present prosperity as the natural outcome of entrepreneurial hustle rather than the outcome of intimidation. When later conversations underline how much that respectable paycheck is needed, it is not a moral awakening. It is an admission that legitimacy is not optional when the lifestyle is visible. This is why rank does not automatically map to real estate. A boss who cannot justify his income will live like a retiree with suspicious savings. And a captain who can paper his earnings will live like a suburban success story. Junior's home is modest not because Junior is broke, but because Junior is cautious and, frankly, uninterested in theatricality. He is the type of man who keeps appliances until they die of natural causes, and uses tableware built to survive decades. Why would anyone need that is a worldview. It produces a small house, an older kitchen, and a refusal to treat home decor like a competitive sport. Polly's modest place similarly signals preference, not poverty. Portable wealth is safer, quieter, and easier to deny. Even when money is present, discretion is the point. Then comes the construction story, where the glamour softens into utility-grade pine and convenient signatures. Tony's house is expensive in appearance, but engineered for plausible deniability. The builder is family. Hugh, Carmela's father, a contractor who can keep the official cost attractively modest, while the unofficial reality does what it likes. Labor is discounted by kinship. Materials have a habit of appearing through connections that do not ask awkward questions. The paperwork ends up describing something cheaper than what is standing on the property, and the gap is the entire trick. This is how $1 million home becomes a paper-thin expense on paper and a thick, loud statement in person. The mythology even has a mascot, Pudgy Walsh, the sort of inspector who can be got on the horn to make problems disappear with the enthusiasm of a man who considers building codes an optional genre. The humor is not incidental. The house is built the way the family's prosperity is built. Shortcuts, favors, and a shared commitment to never look too closely at the joints. The rotunda can be grand, even if the pine is mediocre. The foyer can be majestic, even if the workmanship is merely adequate. What matters is not the integrity of the build. What matters is the integrity of the story told about the build. And the house itself never lets anyone forget what it is, a performance. It is large, yet it behaves like a dressed-up stage set. Doors do not close properly. Fixtures fail. The basement remains stubbornly unfinished, as if the budget ran out right after the foyer finished announcing success. One moment makes the satire almost too neat. A wall gets punched, a door pops open down the hallway, and someone walks over to close it again. It is not a melodramatic domestic beat. It is a construction critique delivered with the subtlety of a dent in drywall. Even the acoustics betray the house's hollowness. Sound carries from room to room like gossip, turning the home into an echo chamber where privacy becomes a fantasy and eavesdropping becomes a domestic norm. Ownership and maintenance reinforce the same theme. The home is a business arrangement in domestic clothing. The title sits with Carmela, a detail that is not romantic so much as strategically prudent. Taxes get handled with professional care. Family connections making sure the bills are paid because, inconveniently, governments expect to be paid. Someone like Cousin Brian exists to ensure the paperwork does not become a self-incriminating art project. The mortgage can be cushioned through legitimate corporate arrangements, giving the household a layer of plausible normalcy that most of the crew cannot replicate without laughing. So why does Jackie April's home look ordinary despite his formal position? Because the absence of spectacle can be the surest sign of competence. A modest home can signal restraint, caution, and a basic understanding that the easiest way to get investigated is to turn a suburban street into a personal parade route. Junior's smaller place signals older sensibilities too. The older generation grew up with a discipline that treated discretion as principle, not inconvenience. They lived within an outward normal that made legal income look believable and made illegal income easier to hide. They salted money away for legal fees and emergencies, because in this world, emergency is not an exception, it is a calendar. Tony's generation evolves in the obvious direction. The money gets bigger, the ego gets louder, and the taste rarely improves. The suburban McMansion becomes biography, large, busy, eager to be admired, and confidently convinced that size is proof. It is also physically distant from the street-level work. That distance is not accidental. There is a long tradition of bosses choosing suburban comfort and then being mocked for being far removed from the streets that made them. A leader in a fortress can look less like a commander and more like an executive who never visits the factory floor. The home becomes a kind of self-imposed exile, a way to pretend that the business is a corporation rather than a racket. Aesthetic emptiness completes the critique. The interior is neat, uniform, and sterile, like a corporate lobby that forgot to schedule warmth. There are fewer signs of lived history than there are signs of expensive purchases that mean nothing. Decorations are chosen because they are considered nice, not because they carry sentiment. The famous "do not ask what it costs" moment lands precisely because it reveals the logic. Price is the point, and the whispered number, 3,000, functions like a prayer for legitimacy. The object is not cherished. It is displayed. The home is not a memory box. It is a showroom. Carmela is essential here because the house is also her character study in drywall. The aspiration is relentless. High tea, museum tears, and the cultivated anguish of someone determined to be seen as refined. Yet the performance is routinely betrayed by content. Airport reading instead of intellectual engagement, indignation when others demonstrate understanding, and the desperate need to confuse being moved by imported culture with possessing cultural literacy. An aria becomes proof of sophistication because it sounds grand. A literary reference becomes threatening because it exposes the difference between performing class and possessing it. This is also why her background reads as quietly decisive. A solid, upwardly mobile upbringing that is not impoverished enough to be romantic and not wealthy enough to be secure, producing a lifelong obsession with marrying up and a reflexive disdain for anyone who threatens the illusion with a reminder of ordinariness. Tony's own role is no more flattering. Fine suits and an expensive therapist do not transform a man who spends his leisure time at a strip club into a patron of the arts. The house provides the same illusion his wardrobe provides. A costume of success tethered to habits that never quite leave the street. There is a sharp irony in the way this success still fails to buy entrance into genuinely elite spaces. Country club respectability remains elusive. Encounters with old money families expose the limits of suburban grandeur, and scenes with richer peers quietly underline that the mansion is impressive only within a particular social radius. Even a teenager's discovery that other private school families live on an entirely different planet reframes the household's supposed wealth as something closer to upper middle class swagger with criminal financing. In that light, the garbage mob label stings not because it is polite, but because it is accurate in the most humiliating way. Risk everything and still get ranked as second tier. That contrast explains why the house reads as middle manager nice rather than truly elite. It is impressive to neighbors who share the same aspirational vocabulary, but it collapses in the presence of real wealth. The home signals success in a particular suburban dialect. Big rooms, conspicuous objects, and a sense that a house is a resume. It is the kind of place that looked top of the line in the region decades ago, in the era when this style was the local definition of upscale. Over time, tastes change, and what once read as aspirational starts to read as dated. Still expensive, still large, but increasingly trapped in the aesthetic of people who equate luxury with whatever a showroom tells them is luxury. The land itself complicates the picture, because location is legitimately valuable. North Jersey is not cheap. Property taxes are punishing, and the area signals exclusivity as well as natural beauty, the part of the state that makes the Garden State nickname feel less like marketing. Even critics who scoff at the McMansion aesthetic concede the value proposition. Real estate appreciates, and land is the one asset nobody manufactures more of. On that measure, the purchase can be read as savvy, an investment in a desirable parcel, even if the structure invites jokes about shoddy craftsmanship. The yard, the pool, the setting, these are the elements that hold value, even if the interior reads like an expensive attempt to impress someone who is not impressed. The show insists, again and again, that this is not the romanticized empire of old cinema. This is the version of organized crime in decline, the one that shops for deals, worries about bills, and treats a discount warehouse run like a revelation. These are men who bicker about property taxes and medical expenses, who squeeze petty scams, and who treat a good dinner as the closest thing to triumph. Scenes evoke the reality that organized crime can be less about yachts and more about cracking a parking meter, less about conquering cities and more about arguing over the split on mowing lawns for small-time cash. The demystification is deliberate. This is not a dynasty. It is a shrinking franchise held together by ego and nostalgia. That economic smallness is why so many of the men live in modest homes. Many are cautious, yes, but many are also simply not as rich as their reputations imply. The balling tier is limited. The ones with truly conspicuous houses are the ones with the best legal cover and the strongest appetite for display. Tony, Johnny Sack, Little Carmine. Even then, the show frames those homes as liabilities waiting to happen. The bigger the house, the more it becomes evidence. The more it becomes evidence, the more it becomes a trap. That is not tragedy. It is arithmetic. The comparisons inside the crew sharpen the point. Silvio can justify a stronger lifestyle because his strip club provides a plausible revenue stream, and his home can therefore read as comfortably successful rather than suspiciously lavish. Furio's home is presented as solid and sensible, another reminder that taste and restraint can exist even in morally bankrupt ecosystems. Christopher's earlier apartment signals a more realistic rung on the ladder, and it also signals how quickly money can be squandered when the culture rewards indulgence and punishes planning. Meanwhile, even characters described as major earners often live in residences that remain surprisingly ordinary, because a modest property is a quieter lie than a mansion. The money can exist, but the proof does not need to. Janice's brief leap toward mansion living underlines the enforcement mechanism behind all of this. Legitimacy must be performed convincingly. A couple with negligible legitimate income does not merely look ridiculous, it looks prosecutable. The closer the lifestyle gets to parity, the faster auditors and agents would circle. It is not complicated. A huge home with near zero lawful earnings is a financial confession. It also explains the suspicion that always hovers around conspicuous consumption. A big house and a small paper trail is not just unwise, it is practically an announcement that someone should check the books. Inheritance adds the quieter accelerant that makes Tony's ascent look like personal genius, when it is, in part, privileged momentum. A father who was a capo leaves behind more than money: properties, businesses, relationships, and the kind of institutional familiarity that turns a young operator into royalty long before he proves anything. This is why Tony can feel as if he was born on third base and still believe he hit a double. Even the famous education, a semester and a half at Seton Hall, lands less as credential and more as a punchline, because the actual advantage is not schooling, it is inheritance, access, and a ready-made network of rackets. The show also makes the practical point that a title is not a paycheck. A capo can earn more than older men who cling to smaller rackets and smaller ambitions. Tony's portfolio reads as bigger, bolder, and more modern. Stock scams like Wabistics, real estate angles, and enough earners beneath him kicking up to keep the engine running. His crew includes serious revenue generators, and he knows how to leverage them. Junior, by contrast, is often framed as living in a narrower world. Bookmaking, union skims, and the kind of personal priorities that do not exactly scream growth strategy, from inept collections to petty skimming that funds romance rather than expansion. The difference is not merely taste, it is scale. There is also a meta-explanation the narrative absorbs with admirable smoothness. Early framing leans toward Tony as the top figure, and the visual language of a boss demands a boss's home. When later storytelling refines his rank, the estate remains, and the story backfills the choice. He is a top earner. He has legitimate income. The house was built at the right time. Family construction lowered the visible cost. A later remark about how long the family has lived there helps square the timeline without requiring the audience to pretend the house was teleported in mid-season. The show turns a production reality into a character reality. Of course Tony would live in a place like this, because Tony needs the symbol as much as he needs the shelter. The practical danger of the big house lifestyle is not subtle, and the series treats it like a standing punchline with teeth. A mansion paired with a waste management consultant salary is the kind of ratio that makes tax agents pay attention, which is why audits are treated like a pending court date. There is even a faint complaint that the scrutiny leans into anti-Italian caricature, as if the only suspicious thing about a mansion is who is standing on the front step. Most of the crew therefore chooses homes that look like their legal cover: small, plain, and boring enough to pass. Polly's bachelor apartment, Pussy's ordinary place, and even the comparatively modest residences of men described as major earners all deliver the same discipline. Enjoy the money in ways that do not appear on a deed. Richie's plan to buy big and Janice's taste for sudden upgrades would have been an audit invitation that practically came with a numbered file. Tony avoids that fate because his paper story is unusually robust. When business interests shift, the dialogue makes clear that he needs the respectable paycheck as much as he needs the cash. At the upper end, Johnny Sack's self-mythologizing chateau is treated as the logical next step in this arms race of square footage, right up until the FBI provides the tour finale by clapping him in irons. If that seems harsh, it should. The house is evidence with a roof, and the bigger the roof, the easier it is to spot. Finally, the most cutting interpretation is also the most consistent with the series' sensibility. Tony's house is designed to be plainly miserable. It is impressive yet emotionally barren. It hosts parties, gatherings, and family rituals, and on the surface there are happy moments, food, laughter, people crowded into rooms that were built for crowds. Yet the atmosphere remains curiously uninviting. The home's neatness reads less like care and more like control. The lack of charm reads less like minimalism and more like absence. The possessions read less like memory and more like purchase. The backyard can feel like the only relief precisely because it is the only space not drowning in performance. Even the home's absurdities underline the point. A theater room exists because people devoted to screens will always build more screens. Meanwhile, the basement stays unfinished because the basement is not for guests, and the guests are the only audience that matters. Jokes about a rival's rise to power being driven by an outdated kitchen land because domestic details are exactly what these men notice. They cannot build a stable life, but they can obsess over countertops. A gag about someone turning into a house lands because the series has already established that status is treated as architecture, and architecture is treated as identity. The mansion is both armor and vanity, and the show never lets it be simply a house. So why is Tony's house the nicest? Because it is the most narratively efficient object in the story's vocabulary of ambition, hypocrisy, and decline. It exists because Tony can justify it on paper better than most peers. Because family connections can build it cheaply enough to pass as reasonable. And because his generation is more inclined to mistake display for achievement. It exists because older men like Junior have different values and better instincts about exposure, even when they have comparable experience and access. Most of all, it exists because the series is not interested in romanticizing the life. It is interested in showing the cost of the fantasy. The house, in all its square footage and all its shoddy seams, is the fantasy made visible, and the emptiness it built around itself. Nice house, bad math. Subscribe.